The air in Canton trembled as Lin Zex's torch met the mountain of opium. 20,000 chests curling into black smoke, a fortune torched in defiance, while across the sea, Britain's cannons roared to life, hungry for vengeance. The year was 1839, and the Pearl River shimmered under a humid sky, its waters thick with the weight of a brewing storm. On its banks, merchants whispered of war, their voices drowned by the crackle of burning resin, the bitter scent of opium wafting over a city teetering on the edge. For decades, China had stood as a colossus, its treasures locked behind walls of tradition and pride, but now the dragon's horde faced a lion's claw, sharp, relentless, and ravenous. In the twilight of the Qing dynasty, China was a land of splendor and strain. Its markets brimmed with riches. Tea leaves rolled tight as secrets, silk that shimmered like liquid moonlight, porcelain so fine it sang when struck. The world clamored for these goods, none more than the British, whose island realm drank rivers of Chinese tea each year. Ships sailed from London to Canton laden with silver, for the Qing emperor demanded coin, not foreign trinkets, in exchange for his empire's bounty. Silver flowed east in gleaming torrents, a one-way tide that swelled China's coffers and left Britain's merchants gnashing their teeth. By the 1830s, the imbalance weighed on the lion's pride. Millions in silver lost, with little to show but crates of tea and bolts of cloth. The British East India Company, a beast of commerce with claws in India and eyes on China, saw a way to turn the tide. In the fields of Bengal, poppies bloomed red and deadly, their sap harvested into opium, a drug that crept into the mind and chained the soul. Forbidden in China, it was smuggled nonetheless, slipped past Qing officials in the dark of night, traded for silver in shadowed alleys. At first, it was a trickle, a few hundred chests a year, a petty annoyance to the emperor's court. But greed is a patient hunter, and by the late 1830s, the trickle became a flood. 40,000 chests poured into Canton annually, each one a dagger in the dragon's side. The silver that once flowed to China now reversed, bleeding back to British hands as addiction spread like wildfire through villages and cities alike. The Qing dynasty, vast and ancient, felt the wound but moved slowly, its bones creaking under the weight of centuries. The empire stretched from the icy steppes of the north to the steamy jungles of the south, home to nearly 400 million souls, more than any nation on earth. Yet its rulers clung to old ways, their wooden junks no match for the steam-driven ships of the West, their armies armed with spears and muskets while Europe forged cannons of iron. Corruption festered in the court, officials growing fat on bribes as the people starved. Floods drowned the rice fields, famines ravaged the peasantry, and rebellions simmered in the shadows. The dragon's scales, once impenetrable, now flaked with age. Emperor Daoguang, perched on his throne in the Forbidden City, watched the opium scourge with growing alarm. His subjects stumbled through the streets, hollow-eyed and trembling, their lives traded for a pipe's fleeting dream. The silver drained from his treasury fed Britain's hunger, weakening the dynasty's grip. In 1838, he summoned Lin Zexu, a scholar official with a spine of steel and a mind sharp as a blade. Lin was no court flatterer. He saw the opium trade as a poison rotting the empire from within. Appointed as special commissioner to Canton, he arrived in March 1839 with a mandate to crush the smugglers and restore order. Lin moved like a storm. He penned letters to Queen Victoria herself, demanding she halt the trade, his words dripping with righteous fury. "Your nation profits by harming ours. Where is your conscience?" The Queen never replied, but the merchants of Canton felt his wrath. He blockaded their warehouses, rounded up their opium stocks, and summoned the foreign traders to surrender. The British superintendent, Charles Elliot, stalled, his ships hovering off the coast, but Lin's patience snapped. On June 3, 1839, he ordered the seized opium. 20,000 chests, a king's ransom in resin, piled high on the shores of the Pearl River. With a crowd of onlookers gaping, he mixed the drug with lime and salt, then cast it into the water, letting the tide carry it away. Black smoke coiled skyward, a signal of defiance that drifted across the waves to London. The merchants howled. That opium was worth millions, a fortune now dissolving in the river's embrace. Elliot, caught between Lin's resolve and his countrymen's fury, sent word to Britain. The Qing had struck a blow that could not go unanswered. In the halls of Westminster, politicians and traders raged. The opium trade, they argued, was their lifeline, a matter of profit and pride. Free trade, they cried, had been trampled by a backward empire too proud to bend. Prime Minister Palmerston, a hawk with a taste for empire, saw opportunity in the smoke. He rallied Parliament, painting Lin's act as an insult to British honor, and by late 1839, orders were cut: assemble a fleet, load the cannons, and sail for China. The lion would not slink away with its tail between its legs. In Canton, Lin stood on the riverbank, gazing at the horizon where British ships once anchored. The air was still, the water calm, but he knew what was coming. The dragon had roared, burning the lion's treasure, but the lion's teeth were sharp, iron warships and disciplined crews, forged in a world the Qing barely understood. The merchants who once bartered in shadows now called for blood, and across the sea, sails unfurled, cutting through the waves toward China's shores. The unequal balance that had sparked the opium trade, silver for tea, then silver for poison, had tipped into something darker. War loomed, its shadow stretching from Canton's docks to the emperor's palace, a clash of empires ready to ignite. Cannons shattered the dawn at Chuenpi, iron balls screaming through the mist as British warships carved a path of fire against the trembling junks of the Qing. The date was November 3, 1839, and the Pearl River Delta churned under a sky heavy with menace. Smoke spiraled from gun barrels, blending with the fog that cloaked the water, while shouts of defiance and terror echoed across the waves. The British fleet, a pack of iron predators, had arrived, steam hissing from their engines, sails taut with purpose. Ahead, the Qing navy bobbed in a fragile line, wooden hulls painted with dragon eyes, as if the beasts could ward off the storm bearing down on them. The dragon had roared with Lin Zex's defiance, but now the lion struck back, its claws unsheathed and gleaming. The British had not come to parley. Months had passed since Lin's torch consumed their opium, and London's wrath had crossed oceans to deliver retribution. Captain Charles Elliot, once a diplomat stalling on the Canton coast, now stood on the deck of HMS Volage, his jaw set as he surveyed the Qing defenses. Beside him steamed HMS Hyacinth, her guns primed, and a flotilla of smaller vessels bristling with cannon. 16 ships in all, their hulls dark against the dawn, they cut through the water with a precision the Qing could only dream of. Elliot's orders were clear: break the blockade Lin had imposed, scatter the junks barring their trade, and send a message that Britain's honor would not be trifled with. Across the Delta, Admiral Guan Tianpei braced for the onslaught. A veteran of coastal wars, he commanded 29 junks, broad, shallow boats with sails like tattered wings and cannons bolted to their decks. His men, clad in padded armor, gripped muskets and spears, their faces taut with resolve. The Qing navy was no stranger to pirates or rebels, but this was different. Guan knew the British ships outmatched his own, steam-powered beasts that could maneuver against wind and tide, their guns firing farther and faster than his outdated artillery. Still, he had numbers, and the narrow channels of Chuenpi offered a chance to swarm the enemy. He raised his signal flags, barking orders as the junks fanned out, a net to trap the invaders. The battle erupted with a deafening roar. The Volage unleashed its first broadside, a storm of iron shot that tore through the mist and smashed into the lead junk. Wood splintered like dry reeds, sails shredded, and men tumbled into the frothing water, their cries swallowed by the boom of return fire. Guan's gunners answered, their cannons belching smoke and flame, but the shots fell short, splashing harmlessly into the delta. The British had anchored just beyond range, their long guns a cruel advantage. Elliot paced the deck, his voice cutting through the din. "Hold steady, fire on my mark." The Hyacinth swung into position, her guns raking a second junk, its bow erupting in a fountain of planks and blood. Guan cursed the fog that hid his foe, shouting for his fleet to close the gap. The junks surged forward, oars slapping the water, their crews chanting to steady their nerves. 3 vessels broke from the line, aiming to ram the Volage, a desperate gambit to board and fight hand-to-hand, where Qing numbers might prevail. But the British were ready. Steam hissed as the warship pivoted, its paddle wheels churning the river into foam. A volley of grapeshot, jagged metal shards, swept the attackers, shredding flesh and rigging alike. One junk veered off, its deck a slaughterhouse. Another sank in a gurgling wreck, dragging its crew beneath the waves. The third pressed on, only to meet a point-blank cannon blast that blew its hull to splinters, scattering debris across the water like fallen leaves. The Qing admiral rallied his remaining ships, his voice hoarse over the chaos. He ordered a feint, half his junks peeling left toward the shore, luring the British into shallower waters where hidden batteries waited on the cliffs. It was a cunning move, born of desperation, and for a moment it worked. The Hyacinth took the bait, steaming closer, her crew too eager to chase the retreating foe. From the heights, Qing gunners sprang to life, their cannons roaring as they lobbed shot onto the British deck. Iron crashed through timber, splintering the foremast, and a dozen sailors fell, their screams piercing the air. Elliot snapped orders to pull back, but not before a second volley struck, igniting a powder keg that flared bright against the morning gloom. The British faltered, but only for a heartbeat. Elliot seized the moment, signaling his fleet to split. The Volage and 4 gunboats swung right, pounding the main Qing line, while the Hyacinth and her escorts wheeled back, raking the shore batteries with chain shot, links of iron that spun like scythes, smashing cannons and men into ruin. The Qing trap collapsed as the cliff guns fell silent, their crews fleeing or bleeding out amid the rubble. Guan's junks, caught between 2 fires, began to buckle. One vessel, its sails ablaze, rammed another in blind panic, sending both into a tangled, sinking heap. The delta turned red, streaked with oil and bodies, as the British tightened their noose. Strategy now trumped valor. Elliot directed his ships with a conductor's grace, exploiting the steam engine's speed to outflank the Qing. The Volage darted through a gap, her guns blasting point-blank into a cluster of junks, while smaller boats darted in, lobbing Congreve rockets. Fiery streaks that exploded midair, raining shrapnel on the enemy decks. The Qing fought on, their muskets cracking and arrows arcing through the smoke, but courage couldn't bridge the gap. Guan's flagship, a hulking junk with dragon jaws painted on its prow, took a direct hit, cannonballs ripping through its stern, toppling the mast into the river. The admiral staggered, blood streaming from a gash on his arm, but waved his sword, rallying his men for one last stand. It was futile. The British closed in, their guns relentless, pounding the flagship until its hull cracked like an eggshell. Flames licked up the rigging, and with a final groan, the ship listed hard, spilling Guan and his crew into the churning water. The remaining junks broke, some fleeing upriver, others beaching in a frantic scramble to escape. By noon, the thunder faded, leaving only the crackle of burning wrecks and the moans of the wounded. The British fleet stood victorious, their hulls scarred but intact, steam rising like a conqueror's breath. Elliot scanned the carnage, his face grim but unyielding. 4 Qing junks sunk, a dozen crippled, hundreds dead. Chuenpi was theirs. The delta settled into an eerie calm, the mist lifting to reveal a graveyard of shattered wood and drifting corpses. Guan Tianpei, pulled from the water by his surviving men, coughed river mud onto the shore, his eyes burning with defiance even in defeat. The British had smashed his fleet, but he swore the war was not over. Across the water, Elliot raised a signal flag, ordering his ships to regroup. This was no mere skirmish, it was a declaration. The Lion had drawn first blood, scattering the dragon's defenders, and now the path to Canton lay open. The thunder of Chuenpi echoed beyond the river, a harbinger of the battles to come, as Britain's hunger sharpened and China's pride bled. The forts of the Bogue stood like stone dragons, daring the British to strike, until the sky erupted and the river ran red with the clash of empires. It was January 7th, 1841, and the Pearl River Delta trembled under the weight of war's second thunder. The British fleet, emboldened by their triumph at Chuenpi, steamed toward the Bogue, the narrow gateway to Canton, guarded by twin fortresses bristling with cannons. Smoke hung thick in the air, a shroud over the water, as the roar of artillery split the morning. On the cliffs, Qing banners snapped in the wind, their golden dragons defiant against the iron hulls below. The Lion had tasted blood, and now it lunged for the dragon's throat, its guns blazing with relentless fury. Captain Charles Elliot stood at the helm of HMS Nemesis, a steam-powered warship clad in iron, her paddle wheels churning the river into froth. The scars of Chuenpi marked his fleet, 16 vessels, their decks patched but guns reloaded, now joined by troop transports carrying redcoat soldiers itching for a fight. Elliot's eyes narrowed as he studied the Bogue. North and South Wangtong forts perched on opposite banks, their stone walls studded with over 100 cannons, and Chuenpi Island's batteries glowering from the river's heart. The Qing had fortified this chokehold since their last defeat, a gauntlet to halt the invaders. Elliot cracked a thin smile. Strategy, not bravado, would crack it open. On the North Wangtong ramparts, Admiral Guan Tianpei paced, his arms still bandaged from Chuenpi's wreckage. The sting of that loss fueled him, and he'd spent months rallying his men, 2,000 strong across the forts, their cannons gleaming with fresh powder. Below, a dozen junks bobbed in the shallows, patched but ready, their crews armed with muskets and fire arrows. Guan knew the British outgunned him, but the Bogue's narrows favored defense. He'd ordered his cannons angled to rake the river, a kill zone of overlapping fire, and hidden gunners waited in the hills. "Let them come," he growled, gripping his sword. "We'll drown them in their own arrogance." The battle ignited with a thunderclap. The Nemesis led the charge, her guns spitting flame as she steamed toward Chuenpi Island. Iron shots slammed into the battery, stone shattering like glass, and Qing gunners scrambled to reply. Their cannons boomed, sending plumes of water skyward, but the Nemesis danced through the barrage, her iron skin shrugging off glancing hits. Behind her, HMS Calliope and Sulphur unleashed broadsides, their shells arcing into the fort, blasting gaps in the walls. Qing soldiers ducked behind rubble, returning fire with muskets that cracked like dry twigs, their shots pinging harmlessly off British hulls. Elliot waved his signal flags, splitting his fleet with surgical precision. The Nemesis and gunboats veered south, hammering Chuenpi, while frigates swung north, targeting Guangdong. The river churned as steamships darted between junks, their cannons roaring in a relentless rhythm. Guan countered, signaling his junks to swarm, a pack of hornets against a bear. 3 vessels surged toward the Calliope, their decks bristling with archers loosing fire arrows that streaked like comets. Flames licked the frigate's sails, and her crew raced to douse them, but a salvo of grapeshot swept the junks clean, shredding men and rigging into a bloody tangle. 2 sank in a heartbeat, the third limping back, trailing smoke. The Qing admiral shifted tactics, his voice cutting through the din. He ordered the shore cannons to focus on the Nemesis, a beast he couldn't ignore. A dozen guns roared as one, iron balls screaming down the cliffs. One struck the warship's bow, buckling her plating, and cheers erupted from the fort, until the Nemesis steamed on unfazed, her own guns answering with a barrage that turned the ramparts into a storm of dust and screams. Guan's men reloaded, sweat streaking their faces, but the British pressed their advantage. Troop boats splashed into the shallows, disgorging soldiers who charged Chuenpi Island under a hail of arrows, bayonets glinting in the sun. The ground assault was chaos unleashed. Redcoats stormed the battery, muskets blazing, as Qing defenders met them with spears and swords. Steel clashed, blood sprayed, and bodies piled in the breached walls. A British officer rallied his men, driving a wedge through the line, while Qing gunners atop the fort lobbed explosives, crude bombs that burst in fiery gouts, scattering shrapnel. The island fell in an hour, its cannons silenced, its flag torn down. Elliot watched from the river, his fleet now free to tighten the noose on the Bogue's twin forts. February brought the siege's climax. On the 26th, the British struck again, their ships massed like a tidal wave. The Nemesis led a dawn assault on South Guangdong, her rockets hissing through the air, Congreve missiles that exploded mid-flight, raining fire on the fort. Walls crumbled, and Qing gunners fled as flames devoured their powder stores, a blast rocking the cliff like an earthquake. North Guangdong held longer, Guan himself manning a cannon, his shots tearing through a gunboat's deck. But the British adapted, landing troops under cover of smoke. Sappers crept up the cliffs, planting charges that erupted in a deafening roar, collapsing a tower onto the defenders below. Guan fought to the last, his sword flashing as redcoats swarmed the ramparts. "For the Emperor," he bellowed, cutting down a soldier before a bayonet found his chest. He fell, blood pooling on the stone, his eyes fixed on the river where his junks burned. The British surged over the walls, their cheers drowning the groans of the dying. By dusk, both forts were theirs, cannons spiked, banners trampled, the Bogue's jaws pried open. The river ran red, streaked with oil and ash, as the fleet regrouped, their hulls battered but victorious. Elliot stood on the Nemesis, gazing at the smoldering ruins. Over 500 Qing lay dead, their forts reduced to rubble, while his losses numbered in dozens, a butcher's bill he could afford. The junks were gone, sunk or scattered, and the path to Canton lay bare. He wiped soot from his face, his mind already on the next strike. The lion's claws had torn through stone and steel, proving its might, but the dragon's spirit lingered in the smoke, broken, yet not extinguished. The siege of the Bogue was won, a triumph of strategy and slaughter, and the war's tempo quickened, its echoes rolling toward the heart of China. Nanjing's ancient walls loomed in the summer haze, a prize within reach, as British guns thundered up the Yangtze, carving a scar through China's heart. It was July 1842, and the river shimmered under a merciless sun, its waters stained with the debris of war. The British fleet, a relentless tide of iron and steam, churned upstream. 20 warships and a swarm of troop transports, their decks bristling with cannons and redcoats. Smoke trailed in their wake, a black banner of intent, as the roar of artillery echoed off the banks. The Qing had lost the Bogue, their coastal shield shattered, and now the lion's jaws snapped at the dragon's core. Nanjing, the southern capital, stood as the final bastion, and it would not fall quietly. Captain Charles Elliot had relinquished command to Sir Hugh Gough, a grizzled general with a taste for conquest, who now stood on HMS Cornwallis, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The victories at Chuenpi and the Bogue had cracked the Qing defenses, but Gough hungered for a decisive blow. His fleet was a juggernaut. The ironclad nemesis, frigates like Wellesley and Blonde, and shallow-draft gunboats that could navigate the Yangtze's twists. Over 10,000 men, sailors, soldiers, and sappers followed his lead, their muskets primed and spirits high. The plan was bold: steam upriver, smash the Qing forts, and besiege Nanjing until the emperor's men begged for terms. Gough cracked his knuckles, savoring the challenge. On the riverbanks, Qing commander Yang Fong rallied his forces, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. The Bogue's fall had cost them Admiral Guan, and Yang bore the weight of a crumbling empire. He commanded 15,000 troops, archers, musketeers, and cavalry, spread across forts at Zhenjiang and beyond, with a dozen junks patrolling the Yangtze. Nanjing's walls, thick with centuries of stone, bristled with cannons, and Yang had rigged the river with traps, fire rafts, chained cannonballs, and submerged stakes to snag the invaders. "They'll drown in our waters," he swore, gripping his spear. The dragon's claws were battered, but its teeth still gleamed. The campaign erupted at Zhenjiang, a fortress city guarding the Yangtze's approach. On July 21st, the nemesis steamed into range, her guns blazing as she targeted the riverside batteries. Iron shot crashed into stone, dust billowing like a storm, and Qing cannons roared back, their shells splashing perilously close. Yang unleashed his junks, their sails catching the wind as they darted toward the British line. Fire rafts followed, floating pyres of oil-soaked timber, igniting the river in a wall of flame. The Wellesley swerved, her crew dousing sparks, but a gunboat caught the blaze, its deck erupting in a fireball that sent men leaping into the water, screaming as they sank. Gough countered with ruthless precision. He signaled the nemesis to split the fleet, her iron hull smashing through a fire raft like a battering ram. Gunboats flanked the junks, their rockets hissing. Congreve missiles that burst midair, raining shrapnel on the wooden decks. One junk exploded, its powder kegs igniting in a thunderous bloom, while another veered into a stake trap, its hull impaled and sinking fast. The Blonde pounded the shore, her broadsides crumbling Zhenjiang's walls, and Gough landed troops under the chaos, redcoats storming the breaches with bayonets fixed. Qing defenders met them in a whirlwind of steel, spears clashing with muskets, blood soaking the earth. The fort fell by dusk, its garrison slaughtered or scattered, the river path cleared. The British pressed on, their guns relentless. Forts along the Yangtze buckled one by one, Wuxi Jiangyin, each a storm of cannon fire and desperate resistance. Yang fought back with ambushes, his cavalry charging from the banks, arrows arcing like hornets. A night raid caught a gunboat off guard, Qing boarders swarming its deck with swords flashing, only to be repelled by a hail of grapeshot that painted the river red. Gough adapted, deploying scouts and small boats to spot traps, and his steamships outmaneuvered the windbound junks, their engines hissing with defiance. By August, the fleet anchored before Nanjing, the city's walls a shadowed giant against the sky. The siege began with a deafening barrage. On August 5th, the Cornwallis and Wellesley opened fire, their cannons hurling shells that smashed into Nanjing's gates, stone cracking like thunder. Qing gunners replied, their shots arcing down, one striking the nemesis and buckling her smokestack. Gough grinned through the smoke. Pain was progress. He ordered a feint. Gunboats darted toward the western walls, drawing fire, while sappers crept east, planting charges under cover of night. The blast rocked the city, a section of wall collapsing in a roar of dust, and redcoats poured through, muskets blazing. Qing troops met them in the breach, a brutal melee of bayonets and sabers, bodies piling in the rubble as smoke choked the air. Yang rallied his men from the inner walls, his voice a beacon in the chaos. He unleashed a counterattack, cavalry thundering through the streets, trampling British stragglers, while archers rained arrows from the towers. A rocket barrage answered, setting rooftops ablaze, and the nemesis steamed closer, her guns raking the defenders with chain shot that spun like scythes, shredding flesh and stone. Gough landed more troops, tightening the noose, and by August 14th, the outer city burned, its gates in British hands. Yang retreated to the inner walls, his forces dwindling. 5,000 dead, the rest exhausted, but he refused to yield, his spear stained with blood. The end came swiftly. On August 20th, Gough unleashed a final assault. Cannons pounded the inner walls, breaches widening with each salvo, and redcoats stormed the gaps, their cheers a war cry. Qing resistance crumbled. Soldiers fled or fell, their muskets silent as powder ran dry. Yang fought to his last breath, cutting down 3 redcoats before a bullet found his chest, his body slumping against a shattered cannon. The city fell silent but for the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded. Gough strode through the wreckage, his boots crunching on ash, as Nanjing's flag was torn down, replaced by the Union Jack. The Qing signaled surrender days later, on August 29th. A delegation emerged, their faces gaunt, bearing a white banner and a plea for peace. Gough met them on the Cornwallis, his expression cold as steel. The dragon lay broken, its capital humbled, its river a graveyard of junks and dreams. Over 10,000 Qing had perished in the campaign, their forts reduced to rubble, while Gough's losses, hundreds dead, were a footnote to victory. The lion stood triumphant, its hunger sated for now, but the cost stained the Yangtze red. Nanjing's fall marked the war's end, a thunderous climax that echoed to the emperor's throne, forcing the Qing to the table and the ink of defeat. The negotiations began aboard HMS Cornwallis, a British warship moored in Nanjing's shadow. Sir Hugh Gough, his uniform crisp despite the campaign's grime, faced a Qing delegation led by Chiang, a high official whose silk robes hung heavy with resignation. The air inside the ship's cabin was stifling, thick with the scent of salt water and the tension of a humbled empire. Chiang's eyes flickered with exhaustion. Tens of thousands dead, cities in ruins, the emperors will bent by force. Gough, flanked by interpreters and officers, laid out his terms with the cold precision of a conqueror. The Qing had no room to bargain. The dragon's claws were clipped, its roar reduced to a whisper. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed that day, was a lash across China's pride. The first demand struck deep. Hong Kong Island, a rocky outcrop with a deep harbor off the Pearl River Delta, was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. Once a quiet fishing haven, it now flew the Union Jack, a foothold for the lion to anchor its trade and watch the mainland. The British had eyed it since Chuenpi, its waters a gateway to their ambitions, and Gough's victory made it theirs. Chiang's hand trembled as he signed, knowing it tore a piece from the empire's flesh, a wound that would fester for generations. Next came the ports. 5 cities, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were flung open to British merchants, their docks to hum with foreign ships and their markets to flood with goods. No longer could the Qing dictate trade through Canton alone. The dragon's gates were pried apart, its isolation shattered. Consuls would sit in each port, British flags snapping in the breeze, a constant reminder of the empire's fall. The opium trade, the spark of this war, went unmentioned in the treaty, left to thrive in the shadows, its poison still seeping into China's veins. Silver was the third lash. The Qing were to pay $21 million in reparations, an astronomical sum, bleeding the treasury dry. $6 million covered the opium Lin Zexu had burned in 1839, a bitter irony that turned his defiance into a debt. The rest compensated Britain's war costs. Every cannonball, every sunken junk, every redcoat's rations, piled onto China's back. The emperor's coffers, once swollen with trade, now echoed with emptiness, the silver flowing west as it had before the drug took root. Chiang bowed his head, the weight of the sum a chain around the dynasty's neck. Then came the sting of extraterritoriality. British subjects in China would answer to British law, not Qing justice, carving legal enclaves where the emperor's word held no sway. A merchant caught smuggling, a sailor brawling in a port tavern. All would face their own courts, beyond the dragon's reach. It was a humiliation masked as practicality, a declaration that Britain's citizens stood above the empire they'd humbled. Chiang's lips tightened as he agreed, each concession stripping away another layer of sovereignty. The treaty's ink dried under a heavy silence, the scratches of the quill louder than the cannons that had paved its way. Gough offered a curt nod, his victory complete, while Chiang gathered his robes and stepped into the dusk, the weight of defeat etched into his frame. The Cornwallis's crew raised a cheer, their voices carrying over the water, but on Nanjing's walls, the survivors watched in silence, soldiers, widows, children, their eyes hollow with loss. The war had claimed tens of thousands, from Chuenpi's junks to Nanjing's breaches, and the Qing Empire lay fractured, its pride a smoldering ruin. In the weeks that followed, Hong Kong's transformation began. British ships docked, unloading soldiers and traders, their boots trampling the island's quiet shores. A flag rose over Victoria Peak, a stark silhouette against the sky, and the harbor buzzed with plans. Warehouses, forts, a new hub for the Lion's empire. Across the mainland, the open ports stirred with unease, foreign voices mingling with the clamor of markets, a tide the Qing could no longer stem. The silver drained eastward, and opium crept back, its tendrils tightening around a wounded nation. Lin Zexu, exiled by his own emperor for the war his actions sparked, heard of the treaty from afar. His torch had lit the fuse, but the fire had consumed more than he'd dreamed. Cities razed, lives lost, and China's dignity bartered away. In London, Prime Minister Palmerston toasted the victory, the Lion's hunger sated with new lands and wealth. The Treaty of Nanjing was hailed as a triumph of free trade, a stepping stone for Britain's reach. But in the Qing court, Emperor Daoguang wept behind his screens, the dragon's scales stripped bare. The ashes of pride settled over China, a bitter dust that clung to the rivers and walls. The First Opium War had ended, its battles fading into memory. Chuenpi's thunder, the Bogue's fall, Nanjing's ruin. But its echoes stretched far beyond 1842. Hong Kong stood as a scar, the ports as open wounds, and the silver as a chain. The dragon licked its wounds, its spirit bruised but stirring, while the lion licked its lips, its eyes already on the horizon. The treaty was signed, the concessions carved, and a century of humiliation began. An epilogue written in smoke, blood, and the ink of shame.